Welcome to Biztech's ESG Conversation Show. Today we have Trezelene Chan. She heads Kantar's APAC Sustainable Transformation Practice. Now, Kantar is the world's leading marketing, data, and analytics business and is an indispensable partner to some of the world's top companies. Now, to tell us more, Trez, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Brian.
Now, Trez, can you give us an overview of Kantar and your role within the organization?
Yeah, sure, of course. So as you kind of set up, one of the leading using data, analytics, and insights really to work with brand owners to understand what consumers, need, want, think, feel, desire, and that translating that into innovation on products, services, experiences, but also then what does it mean from, from a communications, from positioning, all the way through into go-to-market. So that's what we do as Kantar. And we complete the cycle as well in terms of measurement of performance as well, in terms of, all the executions that the brand would do in the market. So that's what we do as Kantar. And my role at Kantar is really, starting to transform and partner our clients, right, who are big brands in the world, all the top brands that you can imagine are the people we work with. How do we then work with them to transition into a world where, we can find commercial value, obviously from a business standpoint, but also ensuring that we are also looking after KPIs that really look after the planet and people and society at large, right? As I'm sure you've heard lots of conversation around sustainability, ESG, corporate responsibility, but really shifting that also into, the further down the value chain with brand owners. And that ultimately kind of reaches to people, consumers, therefore driving what we aspire to drive wider scale change across societies or in market with people, who are interactive with brands. So that's what we do, and my role specifically when it comes to sustainable transformation.
Okay. I want to take a step back a little bit and ask you a really hard question around APAC. So
sure,
where is the push coming from for brands from a sustainability perspective? Is it from customers? Is it from investors, especially those who are listed companies? Or is it from their partners? Where is the fundamental push coming from in APAC from a sustainability perspective?
I think it is coming from all directions, right? I think first up, probably start with the most obvious ones would be from investors. Definitely we see that. That's kind of rising, right? Compliance, right? Starting to see, I think obviously see a lot in Europe, but that regulation is coming in. So that's one side of that equation. Governments, governments are starting to also kind of driving that conversation, especially us. I think you're both also based in the region Singapore. So I'm based in Singapore. Lots of conversations around there from a government perspective, right? And that's also driving kind of, understanding from people on the ground. But ultimately, when it comes to at Kantar, what we see is people always say, do consumers care? Do people really care about sustainability beyond corporate, beyond investors, beyond government? We absolutely see that in Asia as well, through the practice. So we have we run an annual study. This is third year running. We call it Sustainability Sector Index. It's running for 3 years. We do it across the world, over 30 markets, including APAC. And you see that consumers here are also demanding that. And they said they want to support companies that do good, right? 58% of them in this region said they want to, right? And they, especially when you start looking at a younger generation, that desire and that demand rises. So absolutely we see it here. I think then the next question, before I'll preempt that question, before you ask it, right, is yes, they care, but do they really do anything different?
Absolutely,
and I think that is the challenge, right? And because I've been, kind of leading this practice a few years, and that's the obvious, and that has also been a key reason for business to say, or brands to say, consumers say they want to, but they're not putting where, their money is, their wallets. They're not changing their behaviors. It's just say, no, do. But that is then back. And that is where, the role of businesses and government have to step up as well, right? How do you facilitate that change? Because not everybody can pay the premium, right? There will be people who can pay for the premium, but there needs to be mass scale change. And that is what we aspire at Kantar to drive that, be a catalyst for that change, working with brands, obviously, because brands have got that influence, right? As big brands out there to influence that change and drive mass scale, adoption. But that will require radical innovation as well, thinking about things differently, right? How do you bring products or experiences out there that can be good for environmental or social needs, but not break the bank, because not everybody's going to be able to afford it. It has to be a mainstream product.
And I want to use a very specific examples of the disconnect then between what consumers are saying and how they actually voting with their wallets. Fast fashion has been very an industry that has been criticized for really not having adequate sustainability practices in place. And if you look at brands like Shein and stuff like that, where basically the pressure to drive low cost products through the chain, and basically then consumers are continuing to support the brand. They're listing in the US.
Yeah.
So there's a disconnect, isn't that, between the fact that yes, I want to do sustainability, but hey, that's really cool and that's cheap. I want to buy that, and to hell with sustainability.
Yeah. So let me try and unpack that, because I don't think it's a one answer side. I mean, again, you have seen it being, going through IPO and all that through Shein. I mean, obviously it's great success, but let's try and unpack that, right? I think first thing, when we look at consumers, doesn't matter whether it's in Asia or in Europe, where it's more developed, right? Where you have seen more actions around, adoption of products that are green. There are people are not all at the same journey, right? So we've also segmented through the Sustainable Sector Index consumer segments with regards to sustainability, where it's environmental and social attitudes, and the ability to kind of, actually doing something about it. And you then start seeing that you've got 4 segments. You've got your actives, people who believe in it and are taking, aligning broadly, their actions are aligning what they say they want to do. You've got considerers who absolutely, understand that there is a need to change, but still, needs a bit more to kind of get that over the line, probably more for pragmatic reasons rather than not necessarily wanting to do it. You've got what we call believers that know, yes, there is, there's climate change. Yeah, we think it's a problem broadly, but actually for them, that believer switch is really around peers, influence. How do I look amongst my group? If somebody else is doing it, they're more likely to follow, right? So we've got a group. So the motivation's a bit different really through these segments I shared. And we've got the last one, which is called dismisses. This, for some reason, just not engaging, don't believe they've got anything, they don't need to do anything. It's down to the businesses or the governments to sort it out. So we've got 4 groups, right? So this is where you need to also understand this range. And my assumption, right, for fast fashion, right, if assuming the consumer's aware of what that brand or what they're kind of putting through and what's going behind it, I'll assume that a lot of their audience, this is an assumption, right? So we can't, but I'll assume that if hypothesis, a lot of what we'll class as activists would not be a hardcore or core audience of these fast fashion. Probably you'll still be a lot of the believers, and you'll consider the absolute dismissers, right? And we know that activists on broadly, across the world, including APAC, they ranges between 20 to 30%, right? So if you think about the rest of the population, which is about 70, right, 60 to 70%, will still be your mainstream, right? Your believers and your considerers. So I think that's what we call a transition as well, right? It's not a switch that you just go, oh my God, I'm going to stop doing everything. I mean, if you ask me, I lead a practice. It's not like if you cut. There are still things that, that I have to still sometimes at points where I'm having my kids' party, I am still using disposable cups, because in that moment I have to use it, right? I mean, unless I start bringing, 30 cups and start washing it there, that's just not pragmatic, right? So I think that's where we need to realize it's not a complete switch. And therefore, if you're not an activist, if you're considerers and believers, they're still on that journey. And they might even be aware of what these fast fashion things or no ethics around it. And I'm sure there's been examples that you might be aware of as well if you start Googling, right? People have engaged with the brand that you talk to. Some influencers were huge supporters, but when they realize what was behind the scenes, they stop endorsing, right? And that probably will be, that person might have been a considerer or activist, right? Probably more of considerer. I think if you're activists, I think they would have known. But majority of the people are still in that considerers, believers. And I think that's where there's a real role for governments, for businesses to start driving that awareness and move that. And I think the other thing that we have seen at Kantar is, one is moment in time. We also look into the futures, right? We're trying to kind of forecast what the future looks like. We know that the activist segments of consumers in Asia included will rise by 2030, right? So if your business don't start transitioning now, 5 to 10 years from now, you're gonna really lose customers when they start moving into, up that funnel where they are really gonna be able to act on what's out there.
Okay, Tres, then answer to your question. Let's have a scenario where I'm a traditional brand owner, family business in Asia, many years. How can Kantar help me develop the ESG focused KPIs and then measure my progress so that I don't get into trouble in 5 to 10 years?
Yeah. So I think it's a full chain, right? I think if you first up is you assuming, right, from a Kantar perspective or for further, let's just start with some basics. Assuming those basics are in place. If you're, the mid-sized company in Asia, that from a corporate perspective, right, you've got your understanding the regulatory landscape, right, ensuring that you understand, what's the need for investment, even because investors also looking for, how your company is measured against certain KPIs. So I think understanding that component will be important, right?
Okay.
For us at Kantar, we'll then spend time with the said company, depending on the category, understand it from a category perspective. What do consumers expect of a player? So give me an example of a scenario. What kind of category? Is it a fashion? Is it food and beverage?
Maybe a food and beverage brand, traditional, because there are lots of this across the Asia Pacific, all brands transitioning.
Okay, let's assume food and beverage. So then what we would do is we look at a food beverage and through starting off with our syndicated piece right now, we have covered over 40 sectors because we know that consumers' expectations are also different by sectors. Okay. And when we say expectations, there is base expectations as well as things that are not expected, but if you do it, you could differentiate, right? So base expectations and differentiators. And through that, we'll sit with the F&B client and say, based on this one aspect of the data is for F&B, we know expectations is waste reduction, packaging, right? So that's the obvious stuff, right? And they're not going to necessarily add value, right? Unless you do something radical, they're going to be risk management, right? Because there's expectation, all players need to kind of solve that in this sector. Then we'll start looking at differentiators, right? Some of the differentiators in F&B, right? Beyond reduction of waste, enabling through radical innovation, right? And I'll give some examples around that. But one is around the E side of things, which is waste reduction and carbon emission. But the other one will be also the social side of things, which is around health and nutrition, around ensuring there's affordable nutrition to all, especially in this part of our world in APAC, where you've got a huge range, right, of where you've got developed markets, you've got developing markets. Even in developing markets, there are people who are still, on the low in the bottom of the pyramid, right, where income is low. So accessible, affordable nutrition will be critical as well if you're in the F&B sector. So understanding those broad issues from a consumer market need will be one starting point. We'll work with the F&B client to say, these are your starting points. And then we'll work with them and say, okay, what are your current core strengths, right? What are the things that you can do as an organization? And start and try and find that sweet spot, right? What are the few couple of issues that you can really make a difference? Both, you need to make sure your expectations are met, but also differentiators. And that's where, and then that's where we have to work specific bespoke work, right? Through more data analytics. And that's where we then move into, okay, these are the issues, these are how they can come alive. And it provides a bit of a blueprint to guide innovation, because you will probably change, you'll probably have to change some of whether it's a packaging, but also maybe the ingredients of your food and beverage or different alternatives. And then through into a guideline in terms of how does your brand show up? How does your brand show up in this conversation of driving affordable nutrition or, reduction of waste? How would you do it in a way that fits with your brand story and narrative and DNA, so that when someone sees you, right, in the retail environment, it's that brand, love it, they're doing this, so how do you bring that story alive? So that's how we work with clients to really provide that guidance into products, or experiences that will hit the market, the consumers will experience.
Okay, Tres, then following up on what you've just said, there's a real fine line between touting your ESG credentials and greenwashing, and telling an authentic story. What advice would you give brand owners on how to navigate this delicate balancing act.
Yeah. So again, I think what I just shared is exactly also a key base kind of, base journey, we'll say, or framework, if you like, to help guide. Because to ensure you're not greenwashing, you need to make sure that the issues you're championing are fit with what your company is able to do, right? Based on your products and services, right? If you are F&B and you start saying that, you stretch into something completely planting trees, I don't know, which is possible, right? Because you're F&B, you probably will be needing ingredients. But how do you ensure that link is being seen, so that the base work is important first up, right? So assuming that you've got clarity on the issues that you can champion as a brand, as a company, that is the important groundwork. Once that groundwork is done, I think, the typical principles, I'm sure you've heard it with others, is the authenticity, right, has to kind of shine through, right? How do you do it in your way, in a way that's fit with your brand, right? When people see it, they can feel, I mean, when it's authentic, you feel it, right? It's a gut thing, right? There is but then at the same time, beyond that feeling, the emotion, right, that you can connect with the brand, is also when they check in and read about it. If there's some people who want to really understand what is going behind it, you've got the evidence and the creds to support it, right? You say what you do, right? And you do what you say. So both have to marry up. I think that's the other component of it. And if things do go wrong, because we are in the transition, no one has really done this, right? It's a transfer, and therefore we also call it transformation practice, is if things do go wrong, I think if it's grounded in, clarity in terms of what's the issue that the brand and champion, and then I think able to kind of, be able to own up to it, right? And just talk to your audience, right? Whether it's customers or consumers, if the issues were being called out for, and how do you then navigate it, I think is also important. Versus, we've seen also some examples where completely, things get pulled down, and people, when they get trolled and stuff, they pull everything down and there's just silence. So I think silence is also not the great response if you are called out for greenwashing, assuming you're not, obviously. I mean, that's the assumption. And then green hushing, I mean, I'll pull the other one. Green hushing, actually, I think, a lot of the companies, at least, with that I'm aware of, clients I work with, some are doing fantastic, amazing, real commitments, right, to environmental, social progress. But they're actually not communicating it to people through the brands, right? They leave it at a corporate level, at a CSR level. And I think that's opportunity to communicate more, because it's good for the brand, but it also drives greater awareness and helps educate people more widely. And that will ultimately, hopefully, get us to a tipping point where, that awareness kind of gets to the same level for most people.
Chris, it's been a fascinating conversation. I really learned a lot, and I'm sure our audience has too. But before we leave, any final thoughts on key takeaways you'd like to leave the audience with?
Yeah, I think the final thought is probably also what I started with, is basically, do consumers care? Yes, but do not let the current level of inaction stop you, right? When I've heard many times that the time, not sure when is our time, is the time right? The time is now, I think, is what I would leave the final message, right? We've heard enough from, COP, if you've been following the some of the latest development. It has to start now, because at the current rate, we are not going to make, the level of requirements to minimize the temperature rise, right? So businesses, brands, if you're authentically believing that your brand is able to deliver to the cause, do it now, and that journey should hopefully get us to a better planet and society, and also commercial value for businesses.
Trez, thank you very much for taking your time to be on the show.
You're welcome. Thank you, Brian. It was enjoyable. I loved it. Thank you.
We've been speaking to Trezelene Chan. She's the head of Kantar's APAC Sustainable Transformation Practice. I'm Brian Fernandez, and you've been watching and listening to Biztech's ESG Conversation Show. This interview will be on our website, www.biztech.asia, as well as our syndication partners, TV stations, radio stations, and websites. Thanks a lot for tuning in.